It was a quiet afternoon when the invitation arrived. The letter, embossed with elegant gold lettering, caught her eye as she sifted through the pile of mail. She didn't recognize the name on the envelope, nor did she care much for the fancy script. It was the kind of thing that usually ended up in the recycling bin, an invitation to some event that probably wasn't meant for people like her. But then something in her gut told her to open it. She sat down at the kitchen table, tore the envelope open, and unfolded the crisp, thick paper inside. It was an invitation to an exclusive party at a grand mansion on the outskirts of town. The hosts, a wealthy couple, were renowned for their extravagant social gatherings, known to attract some of the most influential people in the city. The invitation was addressed to her, and beneath the formalities, there was a subtle request. "We would be honored to have you join us for a night of music and fine company." For a moment, she just stared at the words. It wasn't the kind of event she was used to attending. She wasn't from money, nor did she live in the sort of world where appearances mattered more than the person behind them. She preferred her little apartment, the warmth of her piano in the corner, and the quiet evenings spent composing melodies. The thought of attending a high society event filled her with uncertainty. She had never felt comfortable in those circles, yet something tugged at her. Maybe it was curiosity, or perhaps it was the polite insistence from the person who had sent the invitation. The letter had been signed by a distant relative she barely knew, someone she had met only a handful of times at family gatherings that had always felt more like an obligation than a choice. They had heard about her piano playing, and now they wanted her to perform. The thought of playing in front of a crowd made her nervous. She had always preferred the solitude of her music. The idea of people watching her, judging her skills, made her uneasy. But the invitation felt like more than just an ordinary request. It felt like a chance, an opportunity to step outside her comfort zone, even if just for one night. She sighed and glanced at the clock on the wall. It was a Friday evening, and she had nothing planned for the weekend. Maybe she could go just to see what it was all about. No harm in attending, right? And if it became too much, she could always leave early. After all, she wasn't expected to stay for hours just to play a piece or two and then slip away. The more she thought about it, the more the idea seemed like an adventure, a change from her usual routine. That night, after a simple dinner, she found herself standing in front of her mirror, adjusting the hem of her dress. She hadn't worn it in years, but it was one of the few formal outfits she owned. It was simple, black, and didn't draw too much attention. Perfect, she thought. Her long hair was pulled back into a neat bun, and she tried to remind herself that she wasn't here to impress anyone. She was here because she had been asked. It was that simple. As she arrived at the mansion, she was taken aback by its size. The estate sat at the end of a long, winding driveway, surrounded by manicured gardens and tall iron gates. The building itself was an old stone structure, its walls adorned with ivy that gave it a sort of timeless charm. The grand entrance, lit up by large chandeliers, was flanked by towering pillars, and the sound of laughter and music drifted through the air, reaching her before she even stepped out of the car. She stood for a moment, hesitant, looking at the large front doors. The house was grand, opulent even, but there was something cold about it. It felt like a world she didn't belong to. Her nerves kicked in, and for a brief second she considered turning around. But then she saw the staff waiting by the door to welcome the guests, and she realized there was no turning back now. She had already stepped into their world. The moment she walked in, she was greeted by the soft clink of glasses and the hum of conversation. The air smelled of expensive perfume and polished wood, the kind of rich scent that reminded her of the pages of a book you couldn't afford. A few people glanced her way, no doubt wondering who the newcomer was. She caught sight of a few familiar faces from the distant family connections, but most were strangers dressed in formal attire, their faces set in polite smiles. The host, an elegant woman in her late 50s, with silver hair and a pearl necklace, approached her with a warm but slightly rehearsed greeting. "How wonderful to have you join us," she said, her voice smooth and practiced, as though she had welcomed many guests just like her. "Oh, thank you for having me," she replied, trying to sound calm despite the fluttering in her chest. The woman offered her a glass of champagne, and she took it, though she wasn't much of a drinker. The bubbles tickled her throat, but it didn't ease the tension in her shoulders. She felt the weight of everyone's eyes on her, as if they were waiting for her to reveal something special, something remarkable. But what could she reveal? She was just a pianist. She wasn't from a wealthy family, Nor did she have the polished, effortless charm that everyone else seemed to possess. She wasn't sure if she was expected to mingle with them, talk about business or politics or whatever it was that people like this discussed in their spare time. Instead, she found herself retreating to a corner of the room, observing the crowd. She listened to the sound of laughter, the clinking of glasses, and the faint background music playing from a string quartet in the corner. She could have stayed there all night, unnoticed, but she was soon approached by a man, tall, confident, and dressed in a sharp suit. His smile was polite, but there was a glint of curiosity in his eyes. "So," he said, his tone almost teasing, "I hear you play the piano. I must admit I'm intrigued. We could use a little entertainment tonight. What do you say?" Her heart skipped a beat. She had been hoping she could simply enjoy the evening, but she knew exactly what he meant. They wanted her to play. It was clear in the way he looked at her, like she was nothing more than an amusement for the crowd, someone to entertain them as they sipped their drinks and exchanged pleasantries. The pressure to perform, to be something more than just a guest, was beginning to weigh on her. She wasn't sure how to respond. Part of her wanted to refuse, to say that she wasn't in the mood, that she preferred to stay out of the spotlight. But the look on his face, the subtle expectation, made her hesitate. Before she could come up with an excuse, he was already walking away, casually telling her to make herself comfortable. The implication was clear. If she was to stay, she would have to perform. The idea of playing in front of this crowd filled her with dread. She wasn't prepared for this. She hadn't rehearsed anything, and the thought of playing in front of these polished, well-dressed people made her feel small, like she was just a sideshow. But the longer she stood there, the more she realized she had little choice. They wouldn't let her leave without performing. It was an unspoken rule of their world. You were either part of the entertainment or a spectator, and she had been chosen for the former. And so, with a deep breath, she made her way to the grand piano in the corner of the room. The sound of her footsteps seemed louder than usual as she approached, and as she sat down at the piano bench, she felt the weight of the room on her shoulders. All eyes were on her now. The crowd had quieted, waiting for her to play, as if her music would somehow transform the night, give it meaning. But all she could think of was how out of place she felt. She wasn't a performer for hire. She was just a woman who loved playing music in the quiet of her own home. How was she supposed to live up to the expectations of this room? The moment she sat down at the piano, everything seemed to slow down. The chatter in the room faded into a dull hum, and her heart began to pound in her chest. Her fingers rested lightly on the keys, the coolness of the ivory almost reassuring, but her mind was elsewhere. She hadn't been prepared for this. The sound of the crowd, polished, well-dressed, and expectant, loomed in the background, waiting for her to entertain. It was a pressure she had never asked for. She glanced at the man who had asked her to play. He was standing near the corner of the room, arms folded, watching her with an expression that wasn't exactly friendly but more curious. She wasn't sure if he was trying to see how she would perform, or if he just wanted to be entertained. Either way, it didn't matter. She was here now, and there was no turning back. For a moment, she wondered if she could just get up, smile, and tell them she wasn't in the mood to play tonight. But something inside her told her that wouldn't be the best move. The people in this room, with their expensive suits and perfect hair, would expect nothing less than her best. She wasn't sure she could even deliver that, given the circumstances, but she had to try. She took a deep breath and let her fingers hover over the keys. The noise in the room continued, but it felt as if the weight of the space had shifted, like everyone's attention was now pinned on her. The moment felt heavy. There was no escape, no easy out. She felt small, out of place, as though everyone's expectations were pressing down on her shoulders. She wasn't sure if it was the alcohol in her system or the nerves, but her hands seemed to tremble ever so slightly. For the first time that evening, the quiet of the room seemed less peaceful and more suffocating. She glanced at the people gathered around the edges of the room. Some were chatting among themselves, their voices low but full of energy, as if they were in a world far removed from hers. Others were standing in small groups, whispering behind glasses of wine, their attention only half on her. A few were looking at her directly, their eyes scanning her from head to toe, judging her silently, even if they tried to hide it with polite smiles. It wasn't the first time she had been judged, but this felt different. It was as if every small move she made would be scrutinized under a magnifying glass. She quickly glanced back at the piano and forced her fingers onto the keys. At first, it was just a few hesitant notes, nothing special, just the beginnings of a melody. She wasn't even sure what she was playing, her mind too fogged with nerves to think clearly. She tried to steady her breathing. She needed to calm down. The last thing she wanted was to embarrass herself in front of people she didn't even know. But the pressure was relentless. She thought about stopping, maybe even excusing herself, but that would only draw more attention to her. The music was her escape, her way of expressing herself when words failed. She'd always been good at it, even if she never thought of herself as a performer. This wasn't what she had imagined, playing for a room full of people whose eyes seemed to weigh her down. But she had to keep going. She had to. She played another note. This time the sound was a little stronger, more purposeful. The initial awkwardness began to fade. With each note, she found herself focusing less on the room and more on the music. It was still rough. Her fingers didn't seem to move the way they normally did when she was alone, when the music flowed easily, almost as though it was writing itself. But at least she was playing, and for that moment she found a small sense of relief. Then, just as she was starting to find a rhythm, she felt a tap on her shoulder. Startled, she jerked back, her hands slipping off the keys. She turned to find the man who had asked her to play standing behind her. He wasn't smiling, but there was a glint in his eyes, a look that made her stomach twist. "Why don't you play something a little more lively?" He suggested, his voice smooth, but there was an edge to it, something that will really get the crowd going. For a moment, she felt like the air had been knocked out of her. She stared at him, stunned. Lively. She wasn't sure what he meant, but she knew what he was asking for. He wanted something impressive, something flashy. He wanted her to perform, to make a spectacle of herself, and that wasn't who she was. "I'm not really sure what you mean," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "I'm just playing something I know." "I don't want to—" "Of course," he cut her off, not unkindly. "But we came here to have fun, didn't we? We need something exciting, something that shows you're worth the invitation." His words stung. She wasn't sure if he meant to be cruel, but it felt that way. Her hands tightened on the keys, and for a moment she considered getting up and walking away. But something stopped her. Maybe it was pride. Maybe it was the knowledge that she couldn't let him see how rattled she was. She had to keep playing. She had to show him that she was more than just an entertainer for their amusement. The room had gone quiet again. She could feel the weight of their eyes on her, waiting for her to do something extraordinary. They wanted a performance, not music. But she couldn't give them that. She couldn't change who she was just because they expected it. She played another note, louder this time, more confident. Then another and another. The crowd's attention was still fixed on her, and she realized that maybe, just maybe, she could turn this around. She didn't need to play a showy piece, but she could still play with heart. She could still show them the depth of her music, the passion behind every note, and so she did. She closed her eyes for a moment, letting the music guide her. She let go of the self-doubt, the pressure, and just played. The melody she chose wasn't grand, but it was real. It was honest, something that came from the very core of her. Slowly, the crowd began to settle into a silence that felt different from the tense stillness before. This time, they weren't just waiting. They were listening. She let the music flow, her fingers gliding over the keys with more ease. The crowd, still expectant, seemed to sense the shift. They were no longer just waiting for something spectacular to entertain them. They were following her. Her playing wasn't flashy, but it was beautiful. It wasn't the kind of music that made people clap in the middle of a song, but it was the kind that stayed with them long after it ended. She didn't notice when the tension in her shoulders began to ease, or when her breath steadied. She didn't even notice how one by one the guests stopped talking. It wasn't until she finished that she realized how different the atmosphere was. The room was still quiet, but it wasn't uncomfortable anymore. It was something else, something warmer. For the first time that evening, she opened her eyes to find the man who had pressured her watching her intently. He was no longer just standing there waiting for her to fail. He seemed almost impressed. The room remained still, the silence stretching for what felt like an eternity. She wasn't sure what they were waiting for, but she stayed seated at the piano, her fingers still resting lightly on the keys. She had given them what they wanted, not with a flashy performance, but with something real. And in that moment, she knew that it was enough. It wasn't about impressing them. It was about playing for herself. The first note had made the room fall silent, but it was her final note that had left them all listening. The silence that followed her last note lingered for what felt like an eternity. She kept her hands on the keys, afraid to move, afraid to breathe too loudly, as if the music might shatter the fragile stillness in the room. It wasn't awkward exactly. It was more like everyone had just taken a deep breath and for a moment forgotten they were watching her. In that silence, it felt like the music had connected with something deeper inside them, something unspoken. Her heart was still pounding, but now it felt different. The tension that had been choking her all evening had started to lift, little by little. She didn't know if she had earned their respect or if they were just too polite to say anything. But the truth was, it didn't matter. She had played for herself. For the first time that night, she had allowed herself to truly play. Not for the crowd, not for the pressure, but because the music had called to her, and that, she realized, was the only thing she could control in a room like this. She gently pulled her hands from the keys, her fingers still humming from the vibrations, and slowly stood up. The room was still quiet, but now there was a different kind of energy in the air. She looked up, her eyes scanning the crowd, unsure of what to expect. What she saw surprised her. The guests who had been talking among themselves earlier were now standing still, their eyes fixed on her. The arrogance she had sensed earlier had disappeared from their faces, replaced by something else. Curiosity, perhaps. Some looked almost humbled. A few even had small smiles on their lips. No one clapped, but the stillness in the room spoke volumes. She wasn't sure what to do with that silence, so she just stepped away from the piano, her eyes darting to the man who had initially asked her to play. He was standing near the back of the room, his arms crossed over his chest. His expression was unreadable, but there was a flicker of something, maybe admiration, maybe regret. She couldn't be sure, but it was different from the dismissive look he had given her earlier. She made her way toward the edge of the room, trying to avoid eye contact with anyone, still not entirely sure what had just happened. She hadn't expected to feel this way. Relieved, yes, but also empowered. It was as if by simply being herself, by playing the music she loved, she had managed to shift something in the air. It wasn't just about her talent. It was about her presence, the fact that she had shown up, played, and not tried to fit into their world. She had brought a little bit of her world into theirs. As she reached the far corner of the room, she saw a couple of guests whispering to each other. They weren't looking at her anymore, but she caught the tail end of their conversation. One of them was nodding slowly, and the other was saying something about how refreshing it was to hear music like that. Music that wasn't just about showing off or entertaining for the sake of entertainment. It was about something real. Her chest swelled with a quiet sense of pride. She had done it. She had made them listen, not with flashy notes or complicated techniques, but with something genuine. It wasn't perfect, but it had been real, and that was more than she could have hoped for. She turned to walk away, but the host approached her with a smile. A real smile this time, not the polite, practiced smile she had received when she first arrived. She was still holding a glass of wine, but there was something warmer in her gaze now. "That was lovely," the host said, her voice soft and sincere. "You really have a gift." For a moment, the woman's words didn't sink in. She felt like she had stepped out of herself and into a different world, and now, in this moment, her mind was trying to catch up. "Thank you," was all she could manage, her voice sounding almost distant to her own ears. The host nodded, still smiling. "I'm so glad you could join us tonight. I must admit I wasn't sure what to expect, but you've exceeded all expectations." She had exceeded expectations. The thought buzzed in her head like an electric current. She had gone from the reluctant guest to the person who had turned the entire evening around. It wasn't about the applause or the recognition. It was about the fact that she had made her own space in this world, even for just a moment. Before she could think of anything else to say, the host was pulled away by another guest who seemed eager to speak to her. She watched them walk off, still processing the evening. She glanced over her shoulder at the grand piano, wondering if anyone else would take the seat. But the moment had passed. No one was rushing to play. The music for now had belonged to her. She wandered a little further into the room, feeling lighter than she had all night. She wasn't entirely comfortable in this space, but she had realized that she didn't need to be. The weight of needing to impress, to prove something to the people here, had fallen away with the last note she played. She had nothing to prove. She had played, and in doing so had proven to herself that she could exist in a world so different from the one she was used to. The evening went on, the atmosphere gradually returning to its previous hum, but something had shifted. The guests who had once looked at her with the same air of expectation were now a little more thoughtful. A few approached her with casual compliments, some simply with a nod of recognition. They didn't overwhelm her with questions or demand anything more. It was as if they too had been changed by the experience, just a little but enough to make the evening feel different. As the night wore on, she found herself talking with a couple of people, not about business or politics like the others, but about simpler things: music, books, travels, and life. Conversations that surprisingly felt easier than she had expected. The pressure that had weighed on her when she first entered had lifted, and the people around her seemed less intimidating. They were just people, after all. They had their own insecurities, their own challenges, even if they wore it differently. At one point, the man who had originally pressured her to perform found his way back to her. This time, he didn't ask her to play again, didn't make any demands. Instead, he spoke to her like an equal. He asked about her music, about what she loved most about playing, and for the first time all night, she found herself at ease with him. "I didn't mean to push you earlier," he said, his tone more genuine now. "It was just, well, sometimes we forget that real talent doesn't need to be flashy. What you played was something else. It had depth." She nodded, not sure what to say, but grateful for the acknowledgement. She didn't need anything else from him. The evening came to a close eventually, as all evenings do. People started to gather their things, exchange polite goodbyes, and head toward the exits. As she stood by the door ready to leave, the host came over to her one last time. "I hope we see you again," she said, her smile still warm. "You're always welcome here." With those words, it felt as though something inside her had shifted, something fundamental. She didn't belong here in the way they did, with their polished, effortless air, but she didn't need to. She had played her part, not as an entertainer, but as herself, and for once that was enough. As she stepped out into the cool night air, she felt a sense of freedom she hadn't expected. The night had turned out differently than she had imagined. It wasn't the applause or the recognition that mattered. It was the simple act of playing the music she loved and, in doing so, finding her place in the world, even if just for a little while. She smiled to herself as she walked toward her car, knowing that when she returned to her little apartment, her piano would be waiting for her. And that, she realized, was all that truly mattered. The days that followed felt almost surreal. After the evening at the gathering, she had returned to her apartment, but it didn't feel the same. The quiet of her small, familiar space seemed both comforting and unsettling at the same time. The piano, waiting in the corner as it always had, felt like it was asking her to play again. But she wasn't sure what she was supposed to play. She had left the event feeling a strange mixture of satisfaction and uncertainty. Had the evening truly changed anything, or was it just a fleeting moment? She couldn't stop thinking about the people in that room, their eyes on her, the way they had looked at her after she played. She wasn't sure if she had impressed them, or if they had simply been surprised that she had been brave enough to perform at all. But what did that matter now? The world had continued on, just as it always did. People had their lives, their distractions, their expectations. And she had her music. Her fingers hovered over the piano keys, but she didn't play. She wasn't sure what she was searching for. It wasn't approval, and it certainly wasn't applause. She had realized that night, perhaps for the first time, that her music didn't need to be about impressing anyone. It was about expressing something deeper, something only she understood. Yet despite this clarity, she still felt a pull to prove herself. It was a complicated feeling, one that she hadn't expected. The world she had entered that evening, with its polished suits and sharp conversations, had made her feel like an outsider. It wasn't just about the wealth or the prestige of the guests. It was the way they moved through the world, as if they already belonged there, as if they had always been a part of something bigger. She wasn't sure she would ever truly belong in a place like that. But that didn't matter, did it? She had played her music, and in that moment she had made a space for herself. And wasn't that enough? But then there was the nagging thought that kept circling her mind. What if it wasn't enough? What if she had just been a novelty for the night? A distraction from the typical chatter and cocktail glasses? What if they had forgotten about her already? Moved on to the next thing, the next guest, the next entertainment? A week passed, and still, she couldn't shake the feeling that something had been left unfinished. Her life had returned to its routine. She spent her days working at a small office, answering emails and attending meetings, and her evenings were spent at home with her piano, playing for herself, quiet, introspective, and private. She didn't tell anyone about the night at the gathering. She didn't need to. It had been for her, not for anyone else. But somehow it still lingered in the back of her mind. It wasn't until one rainy Thursday afternoon that she got an unexpected email. The subject line simply read, "Invitation." It was from the same man who had asked her to play at the gathering. She hadn't expected to hear from him again. The email was short, almost too casual, but the message was clear. "We're having another event this weekend, and I'd love for you to join us again. We were all impressed by your performance, and I think you'd be a great addition to the evening." Her first instinct was to delete the email, to pretend like it had never happened. But something made her pause. Maybe it was curiosity. Maybe it was the small part of her that still wanted validation, still wanted to know if she had made an impression. Maybe it was the idea of being part of something bigger than herself, even if only for a night. She stared at the screen for a long moment. She had no obligation to go. She didn't owe them anything. But there was something about the invitation, something in the way it was worded that made her hesitate. Her finger hovered over the keyboard, but she didn't type anything. Instead, she sat back, feeling the weight of the decision pressed down on her. She wasn't sure if she wanted to go back to that world, to those people, or if she was simply afraid of what it might mean if she didn't. She wasn't even sure what they expected from her this time. A performance? A conversation? Or just her presence? After a few more moments of hesitation, she clicked, "Reply. I'll be there." She didn't know what she was walking into. But she knew she had to face it. And in some strange way, she wanted to. She wanted to see if the person she had been that night, the person who played for herself, was still there. Still strong enough to step back into the world of expectations and appearances. When the evening came, she felt a mixture of nerves and determination. She had told herself that she wasn't going to play unless she wanted to. She wasn't going to let anyone push her into a performance just for their amusement. This time she was going to go on her own terms, whether they liked it or not. The gathering was in a different place this time, an elegant mansion on the outskirts of the city. The moment she arrived, she was greeted by the same polite smiles and curious eyes. People in fine clothes sipped their drinks, their conversations punctuated by laughter that felt distant, almost rehearsed. The air smelled of expensive perfume, and the sound of soft classical music drifted from the speakers hidden in the corners of the room. She had almost forgotten how out of place she felt in this world. It wasn't the people themselves, but the way they moved, like they knew exactly what was expected of them, and they played their parts flawlessly. She wasn't sure she could ever do that. She had never been able to fake it, to blend in with the smooth, effortless crowd, and yet here she was again, caught in the same whirlwind of expectations. She glanced around, hoping not to be noticed immediately, but it was impossible. The host appeared in front of her within minutes, her smile wide and welcoming. "I'm so glad you could make it again," she said, her voice warm but with an undertone of expectation. "Everyone's been talking about your last performance. We're all very excited to see you again." The words felt heavy, like a weight she hadn't been prepared for. She forced a smile, nodding politely. "It's good to be here." The host didn't wait for more conversation. Instead, she guided her through the crowd, introducing her to a few people who seemed to take more than a passing interest in her. They complimented her performance the week before, some of them asking if she planned to play again tonight. She smiled and nodded, but her thoughts were elsewhere. She hadn't planned to perform. Not unless she felt like it. But already the room was starting to hum with the expectation that she would. She excused herself from a conversation about business deals and walked toward the back of the room, looking for a moment of quiet. But as she passed the piano in the corner, something unexpected happened. She stopped. Her fingers itched to touch the keys. The piano was calling to her just as it always did. There was something about this instrument, the way it felt beneath her fingertips, the way the notes seemed to come alive when she played, that made her feel like she was truly herself. She couldn't ignore it. She approached the piano, running her fingers lightly over the keys, just testing them like she always did before playing. The sound, so simple and pure, filled the space around her, and for a brief moment, she forgot about the eyes on her, the expectations, the entire world outside of this room. Then, Without thinking, her hands found the keys, and she began to play. At first it was just a soft, tentative tune, but soon enough it grew louder and more confident. She wasn't playing for anyone but herself. She wasn't trying to impress anyone this time. She played because the music was in her, and she had to let it out. And for the first time since the night at the gathering, she felt completely at ease. She didn't notice at first, but soon the room had quieted. The music was the only thing that mattered now, filling every corner of the space, surrounding her with its warmth. She felt as if she were alone in the room, not with the guests who had gathered around, not with the eyes that were following her every movement. For the first time that evening, it felt like the world outside didn't exist. It was just her and the piano, her fingers flowing over the keys as if they had always known exactly what to do. The notes echoed in the room, their sound rich and resonant, far from the uncertain beginnings of her first attempt. She played not for anyone else but for herself, for the joy of the music. The pressure that had weighed on her earlier, the anxiety, the desire to impress had all melted away. In that moment, the only thing that mattered was the music, pure, simple, and alive. As she played, she glanced around the room, half expecting the guests to be whispering or looking away. But to her surprise, they were listening intently, watching her as though they had never heard anything so real before. The man who had invited her seemed to be watching too, but his expression was different now. Not the calculated interest he had shown earlier, but something softer, more appreciative. He wasn't the only one. More than one person had stopped what they were doing to listen, their eyes focused solely on her and the piano. She could feel the shift in the air, a collective awareness that hadn't been there before. The world outside the music had faded. All that remained was the sound of her playing, her soul speaking through each note, each chord. She wasn't performing for them anymore. She wasn't trying to meet their expectations. She was simply playing for the pure love of it. When the last note lingered in the air and slowly faded, she took a deep breath, her fingers still resting lightly on the keys. The room, which had been so silent during her performance, was now filled with a soft murmur. The guests were speaking again, but this time the energy felt different. It wasn't about the usual small talk or politeness. They were discussing the music, the feeling it evoked. Some looked at each other as if sharing a secret, while others were nodding in quiet appreciation. And then, almost as if on cue, there was a slow clap. The sound started from one person near the back of the room, and soon it spread. The applause wasn't loud or overwhelming, but it was genuine, respectful. The sound of it filled the room, warm and steady. She had never cared much for applause. In fact, she had always felt uncomfortable with it. But tonight it felt different. This wasn't applause for a performance. It was recognition of something deeper, something real, and it meant more than any number of compliments could have. She slowly stood up from the piano, her legs a little shaky but her heart full. She wasn't sure what to say. She hadn't expected this. She hadn't planned for it. But it felt right. It felt like she had found a part of herself that she had been searching for all this time. And for the first time, she didn't need to explain it to anyone. They understood. Somehow they understood. The host was the first to approach her, her face glowing with a smile that was different from the one she had given her earlier. It wasn't just polite. It was warm, full of genuine appreciation. "That was incredible," she said, her voice soft but filled with awe. "You have something special, I can't even explain it. I've never heard anyone play like that before." For a moment, she couldn't think of anything to say. Her hands still trembled slightly, not from nerves, but from the power of the experience. She had played as though her whole heart had been poured into the music, and it had reached them. It had connected. That was all that mattered. "Thank you," was all she could manage, her voice quiet, but sincere. The host gave her an encouraging nod before turning to address the other guests, who were still murmuring amongst themselves. She looked around the room once more, and for the first time, she didn't feel like an outsider. She wasn't just someone who had been invited to fill a spot, to play a role. She had become a part of something real and human, something that transcended the pretensions of wealth and status. She wasn't there to impress them, and they had sensed that. They had respected her for it. The music had spoken for itself. The evening wasn't about her playing the part of the performer. It was about her being herself, showing up and offering something that was truly hers. One by one, the guests came over to her, offering their compliments. But this time, it wasn't the usual superficial praise. People wanted to know more about the music, about what inspired her. They asked about her favorite composers, her favorite pieces to play, and what the music meant to her. The questions were thoughtful, genuine, and for the first time she felt like they were really listening, not just to her music, but to her as a person. The man who had initially invited her stepped forward, his expression thoughtful. He wasn't just offering a quick compliment like the others. He seemed to be weighing his words carefully, as if he wanted to say something that would truly acknowledge what had just happened. "I didn't expect that," he said, his tone quiet but filled with respect. "I thought it would be another performance. But what you gave us tonight was something else. Something real. Thank you for sharing that with us." She smiled, feeling a warmth spread through her chest. She wasn't sure what to say in return. What could she say? She had done what she loved, and in doing so, she had found something she hadn't even realized she was looking for. A connection, not just with the music, but with the people around her. She had played for herself, but in doing so, she had given them something they hadn't expected, and in return, they had given her something just as precious. As the evening wound down, she felt no desire to leave early, no need to escape. She had found a quiet corner to herself and sat back to listen to the chatter around her. The music had done its work, and now the conversations were full of substance. People were no longer just talking about superficial topics. They were discussing ideas, sharing experiences, talking about what had moved them. It was a far cry from the usual small talk that defined these types of gatherings. When the evening finally drew to a close, and the guests began to leave, the host came over to her one last time. "You're always welcome here," she said, her voice warm. "If you ever want to play again, or if you simply want to join us, don't hesitate to come by. You've made an impression on all of us tonight." As the last guests left, she stood alone in the quiet of the mansion, the sound of her music still echoing in her mind. She didn't know what would come next, but she was no longer concerned with that. For the first time, she realized that it didn't matter what others thought of her or her music. What mattered was that she had stayed true to herself, and for that she felt free.